Good afternoon, and I'm Jason DeCanio. Welcome to another edition of The Legacy of Queens for Sunday, November 29th, 2020. This gentleman here was a theoretical physicist who we're going to be looking at today, known for his work in the path integral formulation of quantum mechanics, the theory of quantum electrodynamics, the physics of the superfluidity of supercooled liquid helium, as well as his work in particular particle physics, for which he proposed the parton model. For contributions to the development of quantum electrodynamics, this gentleman received the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1965 jointly with Julian Schwinger and Shinichiro Tomonanga. Who am I talking about? Well, he was born in Queens, New York, and we're going to be looking at the man who had a great career in physics and theory, and we're talking about today on our show Richard FEYNMAN, next on The Legacy of Queens. And welcome once again to the show. And we're hoping that you're having a safe and happy Thanksgiving weekend. Richard FEYNMAN. Well, he was born on May 11th, 1918 in Queens, New York City, to Lucille Nee Phillips, a homemaker, and Melville Arthur FEYNMAN, who was a sales manager. Originally from Minsk in Belarus, then part of the Russian Empire, FEYNMAN was a late talker and did not speak until after his third birthday. And as an adult, he spoke with a New York accent, strong enough to be perceived as an affectation or an exaggeration, so much so that his friends Wolfgang Pauli and Hans Bethe once commented that FEYNMAN spoke like a bum. The young FEYNMAN was heavily influenced by his father, who encouraged him to ask questions to challenge orthodox thinking, and who was always ready to teach FEYNMAN something new. From his mother, he gained a sense of humor that he had throughout his life. As a child, he had a talent for engineering, maintained an experimental laboratory in his home, and delighted in repairing radios. This radio repairing was probably the first job FEYNMAN had, and during this time he showed early signs of an aptitude for his later career in theoretical physics, which he would analyze the issues theoretically and arrive at the solutions. When he was in grade school, he created a home burglar alarm system while his parents were out for the day running errands. When Richard was 5, his mother gave birth to a younger brother, Henry Phillips, who died at age 4 weeks. 4 years later, Richard's sister Joan was born, and the family moved to Far Rockaway, Queens. Though separated by 9 years, Joan and Richard were close, and they both shared a curiosity about the world. Though their mother thought women lacked the capacity to understand such things, Richard encouraged Joan's interest in astronomy, and Joan eventually became an astrophysicist. FEYNMAN's parents were both from Jewish families, but not religious, and by his youth, FEYNMAN described himself as an avowed atheist. Many years later, in a letter to Tina Levitan, declining a request for information for her book on Jewish Nobel Prize winners, he stated, "To select for an approbation the peculiar elements that come from some supposedly Jewish heredity is to open the door to all kinds of nonsense on racial theory," adding, "At 13, I was not only converted to other religious views, but I also stopped believing that the Jewish people are in any way the chosen people." Later in his life, during a visit to the Jewish Theological Seminary, he encountered the Talmud for the first time. He saw that it contained the original text in a little square on the page, and surrounding it with commentaries written over time by different people. In this way, the Talmud had evolved, and everything that was discussed was carefully recorded. Despite being impressed, Feynman was disappointed with the lack of interest for nature, and on the outside world expressed by the rabbis, who cared about only those questions which arise from the Talmud. Feynman attended Far Rockaway High School, a school in Far Rockaway, Queens, which was also attended by fellow Nobel laureates Burton Richter and Barack Samuel Bloomberg. Upon starting high school, Feynman was quickly promoted to a higher math class. An IQ test administered in high school estimated his IQ at 125, high, but merely respectable, according to biographer James Gleek. His sister Joan did better, allowing her to claim that she was smarter. Years later, he declined to join Mensa International, saying that his IQ was too low. Physicist Steve Hsu stated of the test, "I suspect that this test emphasized verbal as opposed to mathematical ability." Feynman received the highest score in the United States by a large margin of the notoriously difficult Putnam Mathematics Competition exam. He also had the highest scores on record on the Math Physics graduate admission exams at Princeton. Feynman's cognitive abilities might have been a bit lopsided. I recall looking at excerpts from a notebook Feynman kept while an undergraduate. It contained a number of misspellings and grammatical errors, and I doubt Feynman cared very much about such things. When Feynman was 15, he taught himself trigonometry, advanced algebra, infinite series, analytic geometry, and both differential and integral calculus. Before entering college, he was experimenting with and deriving mathematical topics such as the half derivative using his own notation. He created special symbols for logarithm, sine, cosine, and tangent functions, so they did not look like three variables multiplied together, and for the derivative, to remove the temptation of canceling out the d's. A member of the Arista Honor Society in his last year in high school, he won the New York University Math Championship. His habit of direct characterization sometimes rattled more conventional thinkers. For example, one of his questions while learning feline anatomy was, "Do you have a map of the cat?" referring to an anatomical chart. Feynman applied to Columbia University but was not accepted because of their quota for the number of Jews admitted. Instead, he attended the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he joined the Pi Lambda Phi fraternity. And although he originally majored in mathematics, he later switched to electrical engineering, as he considered mathematics to be too abstract. Noticing that he had gone too far, he then switched to physics, which he claimed was somewhere in between. And as an undergraduate, he published 2 papers in the Physical Review. One of these, which was co-written with Manuel Vallarta, was titled "The Scattering of Cosmic Rays by the Stars of a Galaxy." Vallarta let his student in on a secret of mentor-protege publishing. The senior scientist's name comes first. Feynman had his revenge a few years later when Heisenberg concluded an entire book on cosmic rays with the phrase, "Such an effect is not to be expected," according to Vallarta and Feynman. When they next met, Feynman asked gleefully whether Vallarta had seen Heisenberg's book. And Vallarta knew why Feynman was grinning. "Yes," he replied. "You're the last word in cosmic rays." The other was his senior thesis on forces in molecules, based on an idea by John C. Slater, who was sufficiently impressed by the paper to have it published. Today it is known as the Hellman-Feynman theorem. In 1939, Feynman received a bachelor's degree and was named a Putnam Fellow. He attained a perfect score on the graduate school entrance exams to Princeton University in physics, an unprecedented feat, and an outstanding score in mathematics, but did poorly on the history and English portions. The head of the physics department there, Henry D. Smythe, had another concern, writing to Philip M. Morse to ask, "Is Feynman Jewish?" We have no definite rule against Jews, but have to keep their proportion in our department reasonably small because of the difficulty of placing them. Morse conceded that Feynman was indeed Jewish, but reassured Smythe that Feynman's physiognomy and manner, however, show no trace of this characteristic. Attendees at Feynman's first seminar, which was on the classical version of the Wheeler-Feynman absorber theory, included Albert Einstein, Wolfgang Pauli, and John von Neumann. Pauli made the prescient comment that the theory would be extremely difficult to quantize, and Einstein said that one might try to apply this method to gravity in general relativity, which Sir Fred Hoyle and Jean Narlikar did much later as the Hoyle-Narlikar theory of gravity. Feynman received a Ph.D. from Princeton in 1942, and his thesis advisor was John Archibald Wheeler. In his doctoral thesis titled The Principle of Least Action in Quantum Mechanics, Feynman applied the principle of stationary actions to problems of quantum mechanics, inspired by a desire to quantize the Wheeler-Feynman absorber theory of electrodynamics, and laid the groundwork for the path integral formulation and Feynman diagrams. A key insight was that positrons behaved like electrons, moving backwards in time. James Glick wrote, "That was Richard Feynman, nearing the crest of his powers at 23. There may now have been no physicist on Earth who could match his exuberant command over the native materials of theoretical science. It was not just a facility at mathematics, though it had become clear that the mathematical machinery emerging in the Wheeler-Feynman collaboration was beyond Wheeler's own ability. Feynman seemed to possess a frightening ease with the substance behind the equations, like Einstein at the same age, and like the Soviet physicist Lev Landau, but few others. One of the conditions of Feynman's scholarship to Princeton was that he could not be married. Nevertheless, he continued to see his high school sweetheart, Arlene Greenbaum, and was determined to marry her once he had been awarded his Ph.D., despite the knowledge that she was seriously ill with tuberculosis. This was an incurable disease at the time, and she was not expected to live more than 2 years. And on January 29, 1942, they took the ferry to Staten Island, where they were married in the city office. The ceremony was attended by neither family nor friends and was witnessed by a pair of strangers. Feynman could only kiss Arlene on the cheek. After the ceremony, he took her to Deborah Hospital, where he visited her on weekends. In 1941, with World War II raging in Europe, but the United States not yet at war, Feynman spent the summer working on ballistics problems at the Frankfurt Arsenal in Pennsylvania. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, he had brought the United States into the war. Feynman was recruited by Robert R. Wilson, who was working on means to produce enriched uranium for use in an atomic bomb as part of what would become the Manhattan Project. Now, at the time, Feynman had not earned a graduate degree, and Wilson's team at Princeton was working on a device called an isotron, intended to electromagnetically separate uranium-235 from uranium-238. Now, this was done in a quite different manner from that used by the calutron that was under development by a team under Wilson's former mentor, Ernest O. Lawrence, at the Radiation Laboratory of the University of California. On paper, the isotron was many times more efficient than the calutron, but Feynman and Paul Olam struggled to determine whether or not it was practical. Ultimately, on Lawrence's recommendation, the isotron project was abandoned. And at this juncture, in early 1943, Robert Oppenheimer was establishing the Los Alamos Laboratory, which was a secret laboratory on the Mesa in New Mexico where atomic bombs would be designed and built. An offer was made to the Princeton team to be redeployed there. And like a bunch of professional soldiers, Wilson later recalled, "We signed up en masse to go to Los Alamos." Like many other young physicists, Feynman soon fell under the spell of the charismatic Oppenheimer, who telephoned Feynman long distance from Chicago to inform him that he had found a sanatorium in Albuquerque, New Mexico for Arlene. And they were among the first to depart for New Mexico, leaving on a train on March 28, 1943. The railroad supplied Arlene with a wheelchair, and Feynman paid extra for a private room for her. At Los Alamos, Feynman was assigned to Hans Bethes' theoretical division, that's the T division, and impressed Bethe enough to be made a group leader. Now, he and Bethe developed the Bethe-Feynman formula for calculating the yield of a fission bomb, which built upon previous work by Robert Serber. And as a junior physicist, he was not central to the project. He administered the computation group of human computers in the theoretical division. With Stanley Frankel and Nicholas Metropolis, he assisted in establishing a system for using IBM punch cards for computation. He invented a new method of computing logarithms that he later used on the connection machine. Other work at Los Alamos including calculating neutron equations for the Los Alamos water boiler, a small nuclear reactor, to measure how close an assembly of fissile material was to criticality. On completing this work, Feynman was sent to the Clinton Engineer Works in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where the Manhattan Project had its uranium enrichment facilities. He aided the engineers there in devising safety procedures for material storage so that criticality accidents could be avoided, especially when enriched uranium came into contact with water, which acted as a neutron moderator. He insisted on giving the rank and file a lecture on nuclear physics so that they would realize the dangers. And he explained that while any amount of unenriched uranium could be safely stored, the enriched uranium had to be carefully handled. He developed a series of safety recommendations for the various grades of enrichments, and he was told that if the people at Oak Ridge gave him any difficulty with his proposals, he was to inform them that Los Alamos could not be responsible for their safety otherwise. Returning to Los Alamos, Feynman was put in charge of the group responsible for the theoretical work and calculations on the proposed uranium hydride bomb, which ultimately proved to be infeasible. He was sought out by physicist Niels Bohr for one-on-one discussions, and he later discovered the reason. Most of the other physicists were too much in awe of Bohr to argue with him, and Feynman had no such inhibitions, vigorously pointing out anything he considered to be flawed in Bohr's thinking. He said he felt as much respect for Bohr as anyone else, but once anyone got him talking about physics, he would become so focused he forgot about social niceties. Perhaps because of this, Bohr never warmed to Feynman. At Los Alamos, which was isolated for security, Feynman amused himself by investigating the combination locks of the cabinets and desks of physicists. He often found that they left the lock combinations on the factory settings, wrote the combinations down, or used easy guessable combinations like dates. He found one cabinet's combination by trying numbers he thought a physicist might use, and it proved to be 271828 after the base of natural logarithms, E equals 2.71828, and found that the three filing cabinets where a colleague kept research notes all had the same combination. He left notes in the cabinets as a prank, spooked his colleague Frederick D. Hoffman into thinking a spy had gained access to them. Feynman's $380 monthly salary was about half the amount needed for his modest living expenses and Arlene's medical bills, and they were forced to dip into her $3,300 in savings. On weekends, he drove to Albuquerque to see Arlene in a car borrowed from his friend Klaus Fuchs. Fuchs, that is. Fuchs. Asked who at Los Alamos was most likely to be a spy, Fuchs mentioned Feynman's safe-cracking and frequent trips to Albuquerque. Fuchs himself later confessed to spying for the Soviet Union, and the FBI would compile a bulky file on Feynman, particularly in view of Feynman's Q clearance. Informed that Arlene was dying, Feynman drove to Albuquerque and sat with her for hours until she died on June 16, 1945. He then immersed himself in work on the project and was present at the Trinity nuclear test. Feynman claimed to be the only person to see the explosion without the very dark glasses or welder's lenses provided, reasoning that it was safe to look through a truck windshield, as it would screen out the harmful ultraviolet radiation. The immense brightness of the explosion made him duck to the truck's floor, where he saw a temporary purple splotch after image. Feynman nominally held an appointment at the University of Wisconsin-Madison as an assistant professor of physics, but was on unpaid leave during his involvement in the Manhattan Project. In 1945, he received a letter from Dean Mark Ingram of the College of Letters and Science requesting his return to the university to teach in the coming academic year. His appointment was not extended when he did not commit to returning. In a talk given there several years later, Feynman quipped, "It's great to be back at the only university that ever had the good sense to fire me." And as early as October 30th, 1943, Beth had written to the chairman of the physics department of his university, Cornell, to recommend that Feynman be hired. February 28, 1944, this was endorsed by Robert Bacher, also from Cornell, and one of the most senior scientists at Los Alamos. And this led to an offer being made in August of 44, which Feynman accepted. Oppenheimer had also hoped to recruit Feynman to the University of California, but the head of the physics department, Raymond T. Burge, was reluctant. He made Feynman an offer in May of 1945, but Feynman turned it down. Cornell matched its salary offer of $3,900 per annum. Feynman became one of the first of the Los Alamos Laboratories group leaders to depart, leaving for Ithaca, New York, in October of 1945. And because Feynman was no longer working at the Los Alamos Laboratory, he was no longer exempt from the draft. At his induction, physical Army psychiatrists diagnosed Feynman as suffering from a mental illness, and the Army gave him an F4 exemption on mental grounds. His father died suddenly on October 8, 1946, and Feynman suffered from depression. October 17th of the same year, he wrote a letter to Arlene expressing his deep love and heartbreak. The letter was sealed and only opened after his death. "Please excuse my not mailing this," the letter concluded, "but I do not know your new address." Unable to focus on research problems, Feynman began tackling physics problems, not for utility, but for self-satisfaction. One of these involved analyzing the physics of a twirling, nutating disk as it is moving through the air, inspired by an incident in the cafeteria at Cornell when someone tossed a dinner plate in the air. He read the work of Sir William Rowan Hamilton on quaternions and attempted unsuccessfully to use them to formulate a relativistic theory of electrons. His work during this period, which used equations of rotation to express various spinning speeds, ultimately proved important to his Nobel Prize-winning work. Yet, because he felt burned out and had turned his attention to less immediately practical problems, he was surprised by the offers of professorships from other renowned universities, including the Institute for Advanced Study, the University of California, Los Angeles, and the University of California at Berkeley. Feynman was not the only frustrated theoretical physicist in the early post-war years. Quantum electrodynamics suffered from infinite integrals in perturbation theory. These were clear mathematical flaws in the theory which Feynman and Wheeler had unsuccessfully attempted to work around. Theoreticians noted Murray Gell-Mann. They were in disgrace. June of 1947, leading American physicists met at the Shelter Island Conference, and for Feynman, it was his first big conference with big men. "I had never gone to one like this in peacetime. The problems plaguing quantum electrodynamics were discussed, but the theoreticians were completely overshadowed by the achievements of the experimentalists who reported the discovery of the Lamb shift, the measurement of the magnetic moment of the electron, and Robert Marshak's two meson hypotheses." Bethe took the lead from the work of Hans Kramers and derived a renormalized non-relativistic quantum equation for the Lamb shift. The next step was to create a relativistic version. Now, Feynman thought he could do this, but when he went back to Bethe with his solution, it did not converge. Feynman carefully worked through the problem again, applying the path integral formulation that he had used in his thesis. And like Bethe, he had made the integral finite by applying a cutoff term. The result corresponded to Bethe's version. Feynman presented his work to his peers at the Pocono Conference in 1948, and it did not go well. Julian Schwinger gave a long presentation of his work in quantum electrodynamics, and Feynman then offered his version titled Alternative Formulation of Quantum Electrodynamics. The unfamiliar Feynman diagrams used for the first time puzzled the audience, and Feynman failed to get his point across, and Paul Dirac, Edward Teller, and Niels Bohr all raised objections. To Freeman Dyson, one thing at least was clear. Shinichiro Tominaga, Schwinger, and Feynman understood what they were talking about even if no one else did, but had not published anything. And he was convinced that Feynman's formulation was easier to understand, and ultimately managed to convince Oppenheimer that this was the case. Now, Dyson published a paper in 1949 which added new rules to Feynman's that told how to implement renormalization. Feynman was prompted to publish his ideas in the Physical Review in a series of papers over 3 years. His 1948 papers on a relativistic cutoff for classical electrodynamics attempted to explain what he had been unable to get across at Pocono. His 1949 paper on the theory of positrons addressed the Schrödinger equation and Dirac equation, and introduced what is now called the Feynman propagator. Finally, in the papers on the mathematical formulation of the quantum theory of electromagnetic interaction in 1950 and an operator calculus having applications in quantum electrodynamics in 1951, he developed the mathematical basis of his ideas, derived familiar formulae, and advanced new ones. And while papers by others initially cited Schwinger, papers citing Feynman and employing Feynman diagrams appeared in 1950 and soon became prevalent. Students learned and used the powerful new tool that Feynman had created. Computer programs were later written to compute Feynman diagrams, providing a tool of unprecedented power. And it is possible to write such diagrams or such programs because the Feynman diagrams constitute a formula language with a formal grammar, and Mark Kac provided the formal proofs of the summation under history, showing that the parabolic partial differential equation can be re-expressed as a sum under different stories or different histories. That is, an expectation operator, which is now known as the Feynman-Kac formula, the use of which extends beyond physics to many applications of stochastic processes. And to Schwinger, however, the Feynman diagram was pedagogy, not physics. And by 1949, Feynman was becoming restless at Cornell, and he never settled into a particular house or apartment, living in guest houses or student residences, or with married friends until these arrangements became sexually volatile. He liked to date undergraduates, hire prostitutes, and sleep with the wives of friends. He was not fond of Ithaca's cold winter weather and pined for a warmer climate. Above all, at Cornell, he was always in the shadow of Hans Bethe. Despite all of this, Feynman looked back favorably on Telluride House, where he resided for a large period of his Cornell career. In an interview, he described the house as a group of boys that have been specially selected because of their scholarship, because of their cleverness, or whatever it is, to be given free board and lodging and so on because of their brains. He enjoyed the house's convenience and said that it's there that I did the fundamental work for which he won the Nobel Prize. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our look on Richard Feynman. We'll be right back right after this. And welcome back to the Legacy of Queens. I'm Jason DiCanio, and this is episode 6, where we're looking at Richard Feynman, professor of physics, science, math, great technology, and great discoveries. Hope you're having a great Thanksgiving weekend as well. Let's continue now with his Caltech years and look at his personal and political life. Feynman spent several weeks in Rio de Janeiro in July of 1949, and that year the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb, generating concerns about espionage. Fuchs was arrested as a Soviet spy in 1950, and the FBI questioned Beth about Feynman's loyalty. Physicist David Bohm was arrested on December 4th of 1950, and he migrated to Brazil in October of 1951. Because of the fears of a nuclear war, a girlfriend told Feynman that he should also consider moving to South America. He had a sabbatical coming for the 1951-52 season and elected to spend it in Brazil, where he gave courses at the Centro Brasileiro de Pasquasis Físicas. In Brazil, Feynman was impressed with samba music and learned to play the frigideira, a metal percussion instrument based on a frying pan. He was an enthusiastic amateur player of bongo and congo drums and often played them in the pit orchestra and musicals. And he spent time in Rio with his friend Bohm, but Bohm could not convince Feynman to investigate Bohm's ideas of physics, or on physics. Feynman did not return to Cornell. Bacher, who had been instrumental in bringing Feynman to Cornell, had lured him to the California Institute of Technology. Part of the deal was that he could spend his first year on sabbatical in Brazil. He had become smitten by Mary Louise Bell from Neodesha, Kansas. They had met in a cafeteria in Cornell where she had studied the history of Mexican art and textiles. She later followed him to Caltech, where he gave a lecture. And while he was in Brazil, she taught classes on the history of furniture and interiors at Michigan State University. He proposed to her by mail from Rio de Janeiro, and they married in Boise, Idaho on June 28, 1952, shortly after he returned. They frequently quarreled, and she was frightened by his violent temper. Their politics were different. Although he registered and voted as a Republican, she was more conservative, and her opinion on the 1954 Oppenheimer security hearing, "Where is the smoke?" or "Where there's smoke, there's fire," offended him. They separated on May 20th, 1956. An interlocutory decree of divorce was entered on June 19th, 1956. On the grounds of extreme cruelty, the divorce became final on May 5th of 1958. In the wake of the 57 Sputnik crisis, the U.S. government's interest in science rose for a time. Feynman was considered for a seat on the president's Science Advisory Committee, but he was not appointed. And at this time, the FBI interviewed a woman close to Feynman, possibly Mary Lou, who sent a written statement to J. Edgar Hoover on August 8th of 1958 stating, "I don't know, but I believe that Richard Feynman is either a communist or a very strongly pro-communist, and as such is a very definite security risk. And this man, in my opinion, an extremely complex and dangerous person, a very dangerous person to have in a position of public trust. In matters of intrigue, Richard Feynman is, I believe, immensely clever, indeed a genius, and he is, I further believe, completely ruthless, unhampered by morals, ethics, or religion, and will stop at absolutely nothing to achieve his ends." The U.S. government nevertheless sent Feynman to Geneva for the September 1958 Atoms for Peace conference. On the beach at Lake Geneva, he met Gwyneth Haworth, who was from Ripon, Yorkshire, and working in Switzerland as an au pair. Feynman's love life had been turbulent since his divorce. His previous girlfriend had walked off with his Albert Einstein Award medal, and on the advice of an earlier girlfriend, had feigned pregnancy and blackmailed him into paying for an abortion, then used the money to buy furniture. When Feynman found that Haworth was being paid only $25 a month, he offered her $20 a week to be his live-in maid. Feynman knew that his sort of behavior was illegal under the Mann Act, so he had a friend, Matthew Sands, act as her sponsor. Haworth pointed out that she had already had 2 boyfriends, but decided to take Feynman up on his offer and arrived in Altadena, California, in June of 1959. And she made a point of dating other men, but Feynman proposed in early 1960. They were married on September 24, 1960, at the Huntington Hotel in Pasadena. They had a son, Carl, in 62, and adopted a daughter, Michelle, in 68. Besides their home in Altadena, they had a beach house in Baja, California, purchased with the money from Feynman's Nobel Prize. Feynman tried marijuana and ketamine at John Lilly's sensory deprivation tanks as a way of studying consciousness. He gave up alcohol when he began to show vague early signs of alcoholism, and as he did not want to do anything that could damage his brain. Despite his curiosity about hallucinations, he was reluctant to experiment with LSD. There had been protests over his alleged sexism in 1968 and again in 72, but there is no evidence he discriminated against women. Feynman recalled protesters entering a hall and picketing a lecture he was about to make in San Francisco, calling him a sexist pig. Seeing the protesters, as Feynman later recalled the incident, he addressed institutional sexism by saying that women do indeed suffer prejudice and discrimination in physics. Well, at Caltech, Feynman investigated the physics of the superfluidity of supercooled liquid helium, where helium seems to display a complete lack of viscosity when flowing. Feynman provided a quantum mechanical explanation for the Soviet physicist Lev Landau's theory of superfluidity. Applying the Schrödinger equation to the question shown that the superfluid was displaying quantum mechanical behavior observable on a macroscopic scale. Now, this helped with the problem of superconductivity, but the solution eluded Feynman. It was solved with the BCS theory of superconductivity, proposed by John Bardeen, Leon Neil Cooper, and John Robert Schiffer, in 1957. Feynman was inspired by a desire to quantize the Wheeler-Feynman absorber theory of electrodynamics. He laid the groundwork for the path integral formulation in Feynman diagrams. With Murray-Gell-Mann, Feynman developed a model of weak decay, which showed that the current coupling in the process is a combination of vector and axial currents. An example of weak decay is the decay of a neutron into an electron, a proton, and an anti-neutrino, although E.C. George Sudarshan and Robert Marshak developed the theory nearly simultaneously. Feynman's collaboration with Murray-Gell-Mann was seen as seminal because the weak interaction was neatly described by the vector and axial current. It thus combined the 1933 beta decay theory of Enrico Fermi with an explanation of parity violation. Feynman attempted an explanation called the Parton model of the strong interactions governing nucleon scattering. The Parton model emerged as a complement to the quark model developed by Gell-Mann. The relationship between the two models was murky. Gell-Mann referred to Feynman's partons derisively as put-ons, and in the mid-60s, physicists believed that quarks were just a bookkeeping device for symmetry numbers, not real particles. The statistics of the omega minus particle, if it were interpreted as three identical strange quarks bound together, seemed impossible if quarks were real. The SLAC National Accelerator Laboratory deep inelastic scattering experiments of the late 60s showed that nucleons, that's protons and neutrons, contained point-like particles that scattered electrons. It was natural to identify these with quarks, but Feynman's Parton model attempted to interpret the experimental data in a way that did not introduce additional hypotheses. For example, the data showed that some 45% of the energy momentum was carried by electrically neutral particles in the nucleon. These electrically neutral particles are now seen to be the gluons that carry the forces between the quarks, and their three-valued color quantum number solves the omega minus problem. Feynman did not dispute the quark model. For example, when the fifth quark was discovered in 1977, Feynman immediately pointed out to his students that this discovery implied the existence of a sixth quark, which was discovered in the decade after his death. After the success of quantum electrodynamics, Feynman turned to quantum gravity, and by analogy with the photon, which has a spin 1, he investigated the consequences of a free massless spin 2 field and derived the Einstein field equation of general relativity, but little more. The computational device that Feynman discovered then for gravity, quote-unquote ghosts, which are particles in the interior of his diagrams that have the wrong connection between spin and statistics, have proved invaluable in explaining the quantum particle behavior of the Yang-Mills theories. For example, quantum chromodynamics and the electroweak theory. He did work on all four of the forces of nature: electromagnetic, the weak force, the strong force, and gravity. John and Mary Gribben state in their book on Feynman that nobody else had made such influential contributions to the investigation of all four of the interactions. Partly as a way to bring publicity to progress in physics, Feynman offered $1,000 prizes for two of his challenges in nanotechnology, and one was claimed by William McLellan and the other by Tom Newman. Feynman was also interested in a relationship between physics and computation. He was also one of the first scientists to concede the possibility of quantum computers. In the 1980s, he began to spend his summers working at Thinking Machines Corporation, helping to build some of the first parallel supercomputers and considering the construction of quantum computers. From 1984 to 1986, he developed a variational method for the approximate calculation of path integrals, which has led to a powerful method of converting divergent perturbation expansions into convergent strong coupling expansions. That's variational perturbation theory, and as a consequence of the most accurate determination of critical exponents measured in satellite experiments. Well, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll continue our look at Richard Feynman right after this. And welcome back to The Legacy of Queens, episode 6 here on Anchor and Spotify. I'm Jason Icanio and hope you're enjoying your Thanksgiving weekend as you are enjoying this look at Richard Feynman, physicist, and of course going on to so many discoveries in quantum theories and mechanics and all the good stuff. Next week on the program, we have a really special treat for you. She was an American psychologist, television personality, advice columnist, and writer. And she became famous in her 1955 for winning the top prize in the American game show, the $64,000 Question. Her fame from the game show allowed her to go on to host various advice columns and television shows which established her as a pioneer in the field of pop psychology. She grew up in a Jewish household in Far Rockaway, Queens. Episode 7 next week on The Legacy of Queens captures the life of Dr. Joyce Brothers. And that's who we'll be looking at next week on The Legacy of Queens. So in 1978, Feynman sought medical treatment for abdominal pains and was diagnosed with liposarcoma, a rare form of cancer. Surgeons removed a tumor the size of a football that had crushed one kidney and his spleen. Further operations were performed in October of 1986 and October of 1987, and he was again hospitalized at the UCLA Medical Center on February 3rd, 1988. A ruptured duodenal ulcer caused kidney failure, and he declined to undergo the dialysis that might have prolonged his life for a few months. Watched over by his wife Gwyneth, sister Joan, and cousin Frances Lewine, he died on February 15th, 1988, at age 69. When FEYNMAN was nearing death, he asked his friend and colleague Danny Hills why Hills appeared so sad. Hills replied that he thought FEYNMAN was going to die soon. And FEYNMAN said that this sometimes bothered him too, adding, when you get to be as old as he was and have told so many stories to so many people, even when he was dead, he would not be completely gone. Near the end of his life, FEYNMAN attempted to visit the Tuvan Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic in Russia, a dream thwarted by Cold War bureaucratic issues. The letter from the Soviet government authorizing the trip was not received until the day after he died. His daughter Michelle later made the journey, and his burial was at Mountain View Cemetery and Mausoleum in Altadena, California. His last words were, "I'd hate to die twice. It's so boring." Aspects of FEYNMAN's life have been portrayed in various media. FEYNMAN was portrayed by Matthew Broderick in the 1996 biopic Infinity. Actor Alan Alda commissioned playwright Peter Parnell to write a two-character play about a fictional day in the life of FEYNMAN set 2 years before FEYNMAN's death. The play, QED, premiered at the Mark Taper Forum in Los Angeles in 2001 and was later presented at the Vivian Beaumont Theater on Broadway, with both presentations starring Alda as Richard FEYNMAN. Real-Time Opera premiered its opera FEYNMAN at the Norfolk Chamber Music Festival in June of 2005. In 2011, FEYNMAN was the subject of the biographical graphic novel entitled Simply FEYNMAN, written by Jim Ottaviani and illustrated by Leland Myrick. 2013, FEYNMAN's role on the Rogers Commission was dramatized by the BBC in The Challenger, U.S. title The Challenger Disaster, with William Hurt playing FEYNMAN. In 2016, a book called Idea Makers, Personal Perspectives on the Lives and Ideas of Some Notable People. It states that one of the things FEYNMAN often said was that peace of mind is the most important prerequisite for creative work. FEYNMAN felt one should do everything possible to achieve that peace of mind. And FEYNMAN is commemorated in various ways. May 4th of 2005, the United States Postal Service issued the American Scientist commemorative set of 4 37-cent self-adhesive stamps in several configurations. The scientists depicted were Richard FEYNMAN, John von Neumann, Barbara McClintock, and Josiah Willard Gibbs. FEYNMAN's stamp, sepia tone, features a photograph of a 30-something FEYNMAN and 8 small FEYNMAN diagrams. The stamps were designed by Victor Stabin under the artistic direction of Carl T. Herman. The main building for the computing division at Fermilab is named the FEYNMAN Computing Center in his honor. And a photograph of Richard FEYNMAN giving a lecture was part of the 1997 poster series commissioned by Apple Inc. for their Think Different advertising campaign. Well, looking at the legacy of this gentleman over the course of his 69 years on this earth, one can say that this man, although he left this earth too early in life, gave us so much to look forward to in the future. And probably 10 to 20 years from now, there's going to be a lot more that Richard FEYNMAN will be given credit to, even after his death, some 32 years later. I'm Jason DeCanio, and hope you are enjoying this series of The Legacy of Queens. And again, next week on Episode 7, which is going to be December 6th, we'll be looking at Dr. Joyce Brothers. Hope you have a great rest of the Thanksgiving weekend. Safe and happy Monday to you. We'll see you on the Queens New Yorker for episode 153. Have a great day. And remember, be honest, be real. I keep it simple, stupid. Kiss. And go out and do some soul searching. Bye-bye.
Don't forget to subscribe to the David3000 Network for great more content like this one.